Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and this week I'm talking about vampires, apparently. I wanted to get back into talking about Rifts and going through some of my favorite old Rifts books. And for a lot of people, and me included, it all kind of started with the very first World Book. Rifts came out, and the premise of Rifts, if you're not familiar with it, is that it is a post-apocalyptic world, version of Earth in which magic is everywhere and high technology is also everywhere, and monsters are also everywhere. Kind of the basic pitch for it is that anything that exists, you can find a place for it in the world of Rifts. But in a drilling down into it, what's going on under the hood is the default setting is North America. There are some massive high tech kingdoms of human beings. There are a bunch of other powerful kingdoms of dragons and wizards and things like that. And down in the southwest, where it's all desert, you get vampires. Now, the Rift's version of vampires is very different, and one of the ongoing jokes with Rifts, I guess with Palladium books in general, is that the ultimate explanation behind virtually everything is a supernatural intelligence, a giant tentacle Cthulhu style monster that is incredibly powerful and magical and is controlling things behind the scenes. That is also true of how they explain vampires. But you can play for years in this setting without ever having to deal with that aspect of vampires because the the actual rubber hits the road kind of vampires are very similar to the classic ones that we're familiar with. Well, in a way, these are not your Anne Rice Interview with a Vampire, Vampire the Masquerade kind of high class political vampires. These are power hungry monsters intent on taking over the world, and especially in the world of Rifts, where there isn't really a stable society that they can infiltrate. What they have done instead is kind of taken over the Southwest, northern Mexico, southwestern United States, that is all very dry and very desert, and because of that is kind of an ideal area for vampires to thrive in. I used to live in Mexico, and in fact, for a long time, I lived in Ciudad Juarez, which is right on the border, northern Mexico, across the river from El Paso. And yeah, there's like 2, maybe 3 weeks out of the year where it is bananas rainy season. And then the rest of the year it is just dry as a bone. And so for a supernatural species that is going to be inside during the day anyway, so the desert sun isn't going to bother them, the fact that there's a lot of just that it's incredibly dry and that you don't have to worry about running water disintegrating you, it makes a really great place. So anyway, I don't have PDFs of these because what I do have is this first printing and the of the original book. This is from 19, I want to say 19 like 89, 1991 July. The book came out, the core Rifts came out a year or two earlier, and it was awesome and it was exciting and kind of blew everyone's minds. And then this vampire book came out, and it was like, here is our first world book. We're going to expand the world of Rifts, and it was vampires, and it was not vampires like we'd ever seen them before. At least 100 pages of this book are taken up with describing what vampires are, how they work, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, what powers do they have, how can you fight against them. And a lot of the powers are here. Let me show off this one as well. This is the newer edition of the book, which has a far inferior cover, in my humble and personal opinion, but in general, I do think is an improvement because it has changed one major section towards the end of the book that we'll talk about later. So looks like the green screen is not going to eat this book because it isn't green, so I can actually show you. Anyway, new revised edition of Rift's World Book 1. So there are essentially 3 tiers of vampire as presented in Rifts. There's the vampire intelligence, and then there's the master vampire, and then there's, I think they call them the secondary vampire, which is more like a feral vampire. This is similar to, more of the, the nasty looking thought vampires, kind of like the more mindless end of what you'd see on Buffy, that are clearly inhuman and that they're just out to, eat people, and they don't really make plans or think. The master vampire is the one that does that. And so when you are trying to deal with a vampire infestation, often the first thing that you run into is a vampire, the secondary vampires, those feral vampires, and trying to track down, you kind of go through them almost like zombies, right? They're an infectious plague. And if there is one secondary vampire, there will soon be more. They're not brilliant, but they're not stupid either, and they're not fully feral or animalistic, and they're able to hunt and convert more people into vampires. And then you try to track that down, figure out what's going on, find the master vampire who's running the show and controlling all of this, and then try to get rid of them. And the way you do all of that is, you have to learn what their powers are, and they have a lot of powers. They can turn into animals. They can turn into fog. They have, all these incredible physical attributes. And then on the other hand, they have weaknesses. They can be destroyed by sun. They can be destroyed by running water. They can be held at bay by holy symbols, things like that. Now, this being a magic tech Rifts world, there are a lot of really clever and cool ways of using those weaknesses. One of the core character classes in Rifts is what's called the Techno-wizard, that is able to use technology to build neat little devices that can cast spells and have spell-like effects through them. And so, of course, there is an entire section of the book that's dedicated to vampire hunting techno-wizard weapons, a lot of which are just magically augmented squirt guns, which I love. There's laser guns that have been rejiggered so that they can shoot sunlight instead of lasers, and they don't do a ton of damage to people, but they can be incredibly harmful to vampires. There's, big super soakers that have water summoning spells built into them so that you can blast water at vampires and kind of erode them away like acid. And again, doesn't do a lot of damage to anybody else, but if you're fighting a vampire, it could absolutely save your life. So there are just pages and pages. Like I said, there's well over 100 pages of this book, of either edition, that is dedicated to explaining what the vampires are and who they are and how they work. But it gets so much more interesting than that. Because, like I said, if in a normal circumstance, when you run across some vampires, you will start the investigation to figure out, well, where are they coming from and what's going on. In something called the Vampire Kingdoms, you will quickly realize that who's in charge? Well, many, many, many master vampires that are all just running this show, that they control everything. There are kind of 3 main locations that are described in the book. One of them is Fort Reed, which is the home of Reed's Rangers. They are the most famous group of vampire hunters. They've kind of taken it on themselves to rid the world of the vampire menace, and so they have a power base that's kind of in the mountains of Mexico. Based on the map, let's see if I can show you a good map of where these vampires live. I suspect that they are in the Sierra somewhere. And see, I used to live there too. I used to live in a place called San Juanito, and then near that there was a city called Creel, which is kind of a resort place, and so we would see a lot of people coming through, a lot of Americans. Um, and I'm not finding the map. Come here, map. Anyway, here, I know where it is in the other book. So let's take a look at that. So anyway, Reeds Richards lived there in the mountains. Is this it? Yeah, so. Ba-ba-ba-ba. Okay, so way up here, you see there on the river, and that's the Rio Grande, which, if you've actually seen it in person, is not grand by any stretch. There's El Paso on the north side and Ciudad Juarez on the southern side. We'll talk about those in a minute, because that's where I used to live. Down here is Fort Reed, which, trying to calculate more or less where that is, there's an area there called the Barrancas del Cobre, which, again, is kind of where I used to live in San Juanito, and that might be kind of where Fort Reed is, which is very exciting for me, and I'm just going to pretend like that's where it is, whether or not that's actually where it is, because yay for me living in a place that shows up in a vampire book. So that's who Reed's Rangers are. They have their kind of base of power, and then they go out and they travel around, and they're very much an adventuring group. They're an eclectic mix of different people, and either edition of the book goes into pretty good detail on who Reed's Rangers are, and giving you opportunity to join them or work alongside them, or even just form your own little vampire hunting band. Farther to the north, where you get into the really desert area, which is like southern New Mexico, southern Texas, northern Chihuahua, northern Coahuila, those kinds of areas. That's where the heart of the vampire kingdoms are. And that's where you get El Paso and Juarez. And this, I read this book cover to cover 1,000 times before I moved to Mexico. And so when I actually did, I was delighted to be in Ciudad Juarez, because I had, it was just a cool thing for me. But they've got, this is Juarez, or this is a portion of Juarez, I should say, because it's a gargantuan city. This does not map onto the actual Ciudad Juarez in any way that I can find. There are, references to an old cemetery, and I know where there is an old cemetery. I don't know if it's the same one. There's a big arena, and yes, absolutely, there's a huge, bullfighting arena downtown. But they don't seem to, I don't think that they sat down with a map of the city to create their game map. I think it is a rebuilt city on the ruins of, what happened to Ciudad Juarez during the apocalypse, is how I explain that to myself. But it's a genuinely massive place, and if you're not familiar with it, El Paso and Juarez are essentially one gigantic city with an international border running through the middle of it. And if you count both of them together, they are without question one of the largest cities in North America, approaching Houston, New York, Los Angeles levels of size and population. They're enormous. And so it kind of, what they've done here is they have posited that El Paso on the northern side is the human-controlled area, and that Juarez on the southern side is where the vampires reign supreme. And it goes into phenomenal detail. You saw that double-page spread map and probably saw that a lot of the buildings were marked with numbers. There are dozens and dozens of specific locations and people and stuff to do. There's things to visit. There are, shops to go to. There are restaurants to eat at. There are all of these adventure hooks all through there. Ciudad Juarez and El Paso can make a fantastic base of operations for a campaign if you want to play a Rifts campaign set in the Vampire Kingdoms. That said, another book that I will be looking at sometime soon called Arsno is also a really good one. If you want to do a vampire hunting campaign and you want a little more stability than the heart of the vampire kingdoms themselves can offer you, then starting in Arsno instead of in Juarez can be a really good idea. But regardless of whether you live there or not, it is a wonderful place to adventure. And absolutely captured my imagination when I first read it. And going back through it again for this review, yeah, it doesn't, like I said, doesn't map onto the actual city or track with my experiences of living there in any way. I love Juarez, and I loved living in northern Mexico just immensely. And so seeing the completely twisted, nightmare, vampire-ridden version of it, even after the fact, is still something that fills me with delight. So, anyway, now the difference between the old edition and the new edition is that the old edition had a whole section on traveling circuses and traveling shows. And that was a really fun thing, and I really enjoyed having it. They had a whole point-based system on how to build your own traveling show if you wanted to do that and things like that. I don't know why that was taken out of the book, but it's not in the new edition. But I can't fault them for that, because what they replaced it with is a much more extensive look at life in northern Mexico. And so rather than dealing with the traveling shows that move around in this area, they've got some talk about, the actual people and the little villages and stuff that are up there. The places that have managed to survive or rebuild after the apocalypse and have put lives back together again. And that's a lot of fun. The book also has a section that goes down into southern Mexico, and more specifically the Yucatan Peninsula. Now that's where something like Oaxaca is. It's very jungle, it's very rainforest, and obviously not a good place for vampires at all. But it turns out to be a pretty good place for vampire intelligences, these supernatural Cthulhu monsters that are kind of running everything behind the scenes. And also a lot of great monsters. There's evil giant spiders, there are were-jaguars, which I love. There's a lot of cool jungle stuff. The jungles don't really get their due. They, comprise 20 or 30 pages out of the entire book overall, if that. And so it's really focused on northern Mexico and the desert area and, life with the vampires. And the jungle stuff is more than anything else, it's an afterthought, but it's still kind of nice to have. And as, a fan of Mexico, someone who lived there and still returns there as often as I can, it's nice to see. Again, it's not even intended to be a recreation of Mexican culture in any way. This is a post-apocalyptic nightmare version. Just like they have taken Kentucky and turned it into this kind of magic monster-ridden hellhole, that's what they've done with the Yucatan Peninsula as well. So, but it's just a lot of fun. So, the Vampire Kingdoms, for me, established a lot of my feelings for and expectations of the Rifts line as a whole. The first book said, here's all the core classes, here's how the world works, here's a brief description of, the East. Maybe going as far west as Chicago, but that just kind of Midwestern strip there. And then I didn't know what to expect from the first world book, but what I was not expecting was an entirely new, completely different setting that serves as a phenomenal basis for an entire campaign all by itself. This is not just an expansion, but a really detailed, really wonderful, really innovative and interesting look at another part of the world. And that is what the rest of the world books do as they go through the rest of Rift's Earth and explore different parts of it. Here's what this looks like. Here's what Germany looks like. Here's what England. Here's Japan. Here's all these different things. Each giving their whole new spin on the idea of the techno-magic, post-apocalyptic, monster-ridden wasteland and how humans are struggling to survive in that. So, anyway, it's definitely one of the classic Rifts books of all time, and one that I strongly recommend, especially in this new revised edition. I say new, it's a few years old now, but yeah. So anyway, there you go. Rifts, the Vampire Kingdoms. Now, let me close with a couple of promotions so that you can all go buy my stuff and I can keep doing all of these videos. I am a published author. I've got, I think now 19 published books because last week a new one came out, or the week before. It's called Stargazer. It is an Audible exclusive, which I learned last week hit number 4 on the overall fiction list for Audible, which is wonderful news for me and makes me absolutely giddy with glee. The top 10 included George Orwell, Agatha Christie, Arthur Conan Doyle, and me. It was really wonderful company to be in, and I'm super excited. So you can go check that book out, Stargazer by Dan Wells. Also, I am a professional game master, and I can run a game for you and your friends. Anything you want, a campaign or a one-shot, possibly even Rifts and the Vampires. So, there you go. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. I am Dan Wells, and you are awesome.